Around 1942 in Johannesburg, South Africa, the country was being controlled by the apartheid regime. At that time, Nelson Mandela was quite a well-known lawyer. After completing a trial that day, he was visited by 3 members of the African National Congress, more familiarly called the ANC, who invited him to join them. In the evening, Mandela visited a club and spent his night with other black people. Later that night, Mandela decided to go home with the woman he met inside and ran into Jackson, who was quite drunk at that time. After chatting for a while, Mandela and his woman left, and so did Jackson, who was about to go home using train. That night, Jackson was bullied by white people, and that incident sadly cost him his life. Shortly after Jackson's death, Mandela tried to seek justice for Jackson's death by discussing the matter with the judge. He showed evidence in the form of an autopsy stating that Jackson's death was due to abuse, but according to the judge, the cause of death was clearly due to syphilis. The judge reprimanded Mandela for accusing the police who had investigated the case and ordered him to respect the law, but Mandela felt that the law never sided with his people. After this incident, Mandela chatted with his colleagues from ANC. According to Mandela, the situation should not continue like this and the blacks must get justice. Mandela was convinced that the ANC also agreed with him and told him to fight together alongside them. After that conversation, Mandela decided to smoke outside and met a woman named Evelyn. Mandela asked her if he should join the ANC, and Evelyn answered that the ANC was nothing but nonsense. Since that meeting, Mandela got closer to Evelyn and finally married her. One day, Mandela, who was training in boxing, approached by someone named Walter, who showed him a pamphlet that the ANC would distribute to carry out a boycott. He also invited Mandela to come with his wife to a meeting with the ANC. The next day, black people filled the terminal to call for action. ANC members distributed pamphlets to every black citizen who came, while Walter and several of his colleagues were in the middle of the crowd leading the speeches. Starting that day, they decided not to use the bus provided by the government. Seeing the action, Mandela joined the crowd. Even though his wife opposed him, Mandela said that the action was not against the law. He approached Walter and, along with the people, walked across the city while chanting. In Orlando, 1948, the Nationalist Party reigned once again. The government made the new policy of white supremacy, which was implemented strictly, which carried the principle that white people were the superior race who had to dominate other races. Injustice and oppression continued to occur, even as far as the government not including black people in the elections, which made them even more offended. This time, Mandela led a speech voicing the injustice that was being faced and told everyone to continue to oppose the government. After his speech, Mandela ended up dating a woman. Unfortunately, Evelyn found out about it, which ultimately made them fight. For Evelyn, Mandela was just someone who didn't care about his own family, yet hid behind the word for the sake of the nation. A few days later, the black people led by Mandela flocked to the white people's territory because their territory was about to get evicted. The police tried to stop them, but their massive numbers were too much to handle. Mandela and the others kept breaking in until finally he was arrested and imprisoned. Not long after, Mandela was released. He went only to find the house empty and all his belongings disappeared. After looking at all the rooms, he found his son in one of them. He sat next to him and asked him to believe in the struggle they had carried out all this time. That day, Mandela and Evelyn never met again. One day, Mandela visited his mother's house in his hometown. His mother scolded him because his way of life made him abandon his family. One day, Mandela met Winnie, the first black person who worked at the Baragwanath Hospital. Before this meeting, they had known about each other, making their relationship run smoothly. They finally decided to get married. They had a lively wedding ceremony and wore traditional clothes. On March 21, 1960 in Sharpeville, the city that had been filled with thousands of people. They stormed the police station to protest the new policy which required all black people to carry their IDs at all times. Everyone tried to destroy the fence. The police came out carrying weapons, trying to disperse the crowd. The rioters began to show their actions by burning their IDs. The police continued to tell them to disperse, but everyone didn't obey and continued to press against the fence. The police started firing their rifles upwards as a warning, and soon, the other police started shooting at the crowd with their guns and injured many. Everyone immediately ran away. This chaos couldn't be avoided. People bumped into each other until some fell and trampled. The police continued to fire their guns and even used tanks to attack the crowd. Tens of people were killed and hundreds of others were injured. Most of the people who died had gunshot wounds to the back of their bodies. The police shot anyone in the crowd at that time, whether men, women, or even children. They did it to maintain the white supremacy. This tragic incident shocked the world, especially the black community in South Africa, since it was their country that fought their own citizens. The anger built inside Mandela's heart, and he took action by burning his own ID to show his protest. In the evening, the police continued to patrol the black community. Mandela was preparing to carry out his action, which he called the movement. He was trying to convince Winnie that the movement would not use violence at all. His colleague Oliver had started the movement, and it was time for him to start too, so he said goodbye to his wife and was forced to leave her, who was pregnant. Some time passed while Mandela was away doing the movement. He distributed pamphlets and continued giving speeches, but secretly, his other colleagues at the ANC training camp in North Africa carried out training using weapons. Meanwhile, Winnie at that time had given birth to a daughter. In the ANC safe house, they began to learn to assemble explosives and began to practice it in public places, and thanks to that, Mandela was labeled a terrorist. The next step Mandela took was to contact foreign media to conduct interviews. He was then interviewed by a reporter from ITN News. The reporter immediately asked Mandela a question about the possibility of violence in their movement, to which Mandela answered that the violence never happened because the black people would have taken the path of peace to get their rights, but what they got from the government was violence and brutality. The blacks had never used violence or weapons. The reporter asked what they wanted, and Mandela answered that what they wanted was freedom. They wanted the black community to be free in their own homeland. A few days later, Mandela was visited by Winnie and his 2 children. Winnie said that she had lost her job, but she kept encouraging Mandela to continue fighting. One night, the ANC blew up a company and someone died during the action. The next day, someone reported to Mandela about the incident. He told Mandela to leave immediately because this safe house place was no longer safe. Mandela obeyed the order and immediately left in his car, but on his way he was caught by the police, who were following him along with all of his colleagues from the safe house. One day in 1963, a trial was held at the Pretoria court to try Mandela and his friends from the ANC. They were charged with sabotage to facilitate a violent revolution and armed invasion to overthrow the government, therefore they would probably receive the death penalty. However, Mandela denied the charges and remained clear that they were innocent. After the trial ended that day, Mandela and his friends discussed it with their lawyer. According to the lawyer, they would not be able to get away from this problem. What they could do was to avoid the death penalty. At the next trial, Mandela, as the first defendant, delivered his answer to his lawsuit. During the trial, Winnie was always present to provide moral support for Mandela. In his answer, Mandela said that he had indeed carried out a sabotage plan, not to overthrow the government, but to fight injustice. He also conveyed what black people wanted, namely equality as the other people of South Africa. They wanted the same political rights. However, as a people who had fought a lot, what Mandela really dreamed of was a peaceful democratic life where society lived in harmony with the same opportunities. The next trial was the reading of the judge's verdict. In his verdict, the judge stated that Mandela and his 7 friends were found guilty, but for the sake of justice, the judge sentenced them to life imprisonment. All the audience at the trial cheered while raising their hands to express support for 8 of their people who had to be punished for fighting for justice. On June 13, 1964, Mandela and his colleagues arrived on Robben Island, where they were imprisoned for the rest of their lives. Just as they arrived, they heard something that made them shiver. The chief warden said that by being on this island, they would regret that they were not sentenced to death. After being given a speech, they changed their clothes together in the field. Everyone got shorts except for Kathy, the white man, who got trousers. After that, each was called to go into the cell which had been prepared. Mandela entered his cell, a cramped and cold room they all had to live in for the rest of their lives. One day, several white people came to Mandela's house, where only Winnie and the children had lived for a long time. They searched the room, but Winnie immediately threw them all out. At the same time, Mandela got up early to exercise. After he finished, he started to prepare, then the guards came to wake up the prisoners. Mandela took this opportunity to convey his mission to everyone. Even though he was in prison, he did not give up. This time, he asked for cooperation from his friends to get trousers, just like Kathy, indicating that they demand the same rights. That day's activity was working in the mine. All the prisoners were busy digging. Not long after, Mandela was approached by one of the guards, who apparently tried to make Mandela angry because he called his wife a crazy woman. A fight almost broke out, but the other prisoners stopped Mandela, saying that the guards deliberately made Mandela let out his anger. Sometime later, Mandela got a piece of paper from a newspaper. A prison guard had deliberately prepared it, and this succeeded in making Mandela furious. One day, Mandela got a letter from his wife. He queued to get the letter, but when he received it, he had to swallow his disappointment because the contents of the letter had been removed, so there was nothing to read. At night, the guards told all the prisoners to stay in the rain without wearing clothes. This had gone too far, and Mandela threatened to report their actions to Pretoria. The news that Mandela would report their situation to Pretoria had reached the chief warden's ear. He then came to Mandela, and Mandela expressed his dissatisfaction. According to him, the prisoners were being treated unfairly, and the wardens had no right to oppress them and acted like gangsters. The chief warden didn't even care about the threat. He didn't even care if he had to lose his job. This was because he had a lot of wealth. Before leaving Mandela, he allowed Mandela to speak again, and Mandela said that he and his friends wanted trousers. One day, Mandela had the opportunity to meet his wife. This meeting was the first since he was put in prison. Winnie told him that she was also detained for some time. She also told him about his mother's condition, who was seriously ill and might not be able to survive any longer. Soon they had to separate again because their time was up. One night, Winnie was forcibly taken by the police in front of her children and then put in prison. After hearing the news, Mandela wrote a letter to his children. He wrote a very touching message. The fact that their mother was detained was clear evidence of their struggle to demand justice. He hoped that when they grew up, his children could understand their current situation and know that they had a great mother. Winnie had received uncomfortable and even violent treatment in prison. The people who took her to prison never treated her well. A few days later, the warden distributed trousers and all the prisoners were very happy and thanked Mandela. The next day, while he was working, Mandela received a message telling him that his first child had died in an accident. Mandela asked permission to go home to bury his first child, but the rules could not be violated and Mandela was not allowed to leave the island at all. He was very sad but couldn't do anything. At the same time, Winnie was freed from prison. Everyone greeted her along the road and in front of her house. After getting out of the car, Winnie immediately approached her child and said something in front of the people who followed her. She thanked the government and the situation that had made her strong and could overcome her fear. 16th of June 1976 in Soweto, there was a clash between black residents and the police. The rioters made an explosion and several were injured. Everyone involved was arrested and sent to the same prison as Mandela. At that time, Patrick, a new prisoner, had just arrived on the island and greeted Mandela, who was gardening. He told Mandela about the situation that was happening in the city. Anyone was targeted, both adults and children. All of their schools were closed. Even in a situation like that, the ANC wasn't around to help them. According to him, they didn't need the ANC anymore. Mandela responded calmly. He understood the man's spirit, but for Mandela, everyone would die eventually, and no matter what happened, the ANC would strive. One day, Mandela was visited by his daughter Zinzi. She told him that Winnie had joined forces to fight the government and she would also join in the fight. Hearing that, Mandela told her to convey to the public that he was full of hope and would do anything for their rights. Zinzi told him that they would not remain silent. They would take action, calling for Mandela's release, which would be carried out all over the world. After 18 years of imprisonment on Robben Island, on March 31st, 1982, Mandela and his colleagues were moved to Poolsmoor Prison, where they got a better place, a fairly spacious cell with a mattress in it, and this time Mandela and his colleagues were in the same cell. In that room was a large mirror where from behind it, Mandela and his colleagues were being watched. The room was also bugged so that the person behind the large mirror could hear all their conversations. Winnie continued giving speeches to continue Mandela's struggle. The resistance they were doing was using violence. They didn't have sophisticated equipment, but they had explosives, so they fought the army by throwing explosives. The situation out there was very chaotic. Meanwhile, Mandela was offered to get out of prison in exchange for the blacks to stop the movement. For Kathy, it looked like a trap, and Mandela was also aware of that possibility, but he believed that this was a new beginning to a solution. One day, when he visited Mandela, after 21 years, that day was the first time Mandela was able to touch his wife again. At this meeting, there were no glass barriers like before. When he said that the black people were getting stronger, the more they were pressured, the more they showed their courage. The government was afraid of them, so she told Mandela to start his actions too. On February 10, 1985, at the Orlando Stadium, all the black people gathered to hear Mandela's answer about the offer of parole. Zinzi went up to the stage and was greeted enthusiastically by everyone. She began to read the answer Mandela gave in his letter. Mandela stated that he was not fond of the violence. He was only against the injustice that continued to befall black people. He wanted to let the government solve this violence and that all black people must be freed from apartheid. One day, Mandela was taken to a certain place. Apparently, he was involved in a secret meeting attended by the delegacies from the government and the National Intelligence Bureau. The meeting was held on orders from the president to discuss the problems currently occurring in the country. They would discuss to find a solution. In that meeting, Mandela was offered power, but once again, Mandela emphasized that what the black people wanted was freedom, not power. They wanted equal political rights. These white representatives expressed their concerns that they thought the country would be in chaos if dominated by black people. Moreover, after all the things that happened to them, white people would be the target of their revenge. Mandela answered that their people would not take revenge because they did not want to live in a terrible situation like that. On the other hand, wars continued. Since September, 300 black people died and only one white person died. That night, a child Winnie knew died after getting shot. This made Winnie even angrier. The child's mother was even angrier. She asked Winnie to take revenge. She wanted the whites to feel what black people feel. Some time passed. Mandela was transferred to a house as his new imprisonment. He thought that he would be killed after he was given all the facilities, but it turned out that he was told to carry out a secret mission to make the people believe in the government again. Since moved, Mandela was allowed to be visited by his family, so the extended family visited the house. Mandela chatted with Winnie about the violence in their neighborhood, and then Mandela advised her by saying that sometimes violence was necessary, but black people should not act like what their enemies had done to them. One day, Mandela had another meeting with the government delegacies to discuss his parole. They also told Mandela about the ban on the ANC and also his race, but Mandela never agreed to the conditions. In the end, he was summoned by the new president at that time, President de Klerk, a Calvinist who believed that God had told him to carry out a special task at a special time. Even after the inauguration, he cried and believed that he was sent by God to make peace in South Africa. At the meeting, de Klerk said that Mandela would be released unconditionally. He even offered transportation accommodation for Mandela to get to his house. But Mandela refused and only asked for the gate to be opened so he could leave on his own. A few days later, Mandela had a party attended by the whole family to celebrate his freedom. After that, he and Winnie went home together to Johannesburg. Everyone filled the streets to welcome Mandela and cheered for him. Mandela then got out of his car and cheered along with everyone who was surrounding him. After they arrived, Winnie reminded Mandela to remain alert, because however, in the minds of the people who greeted him, there was still anger. Mandela approached her, but that only made the situation awkward because they had not been together for a very long time. One day, Mandela and his party had joined the meeting with the government. That day, all levels of the government attended the meeting chaired by President de Klerk himself. At that time, black people had gotten a major part in the government. The agenda at that time was to defend the rights of minorities. The president talked about sharing power, but the black group was of course against that. Mandela said that they needed to share power with the white group to reduce concerns. That day, Mandela met Winnie and rebuked her for not opposing the government and instead made this situation worse. What Winnie said to the people should be in line with his statement and the ANC's policies, but Winnie believed that Mandela didn't know anything because he had been gone for so long. According to Winnie, the people chose to fight and she had to support that decision. She couldn't possibly betray her people. Once again, Mandela emphasized to her that the arson and the killing must stop because they were negotiating with the government and they must show their loyalty. Before leaving, Mandela told her that he would stay away from her. He decided to live separately for the good of the party and for the good of their relationship. After deciding to separate, Walter showed a photo that proved that Winnie had an affair, but Mandela ignored it and instead announced through the media that he and his wife had decided to separate. Some time passed and the current situation was getting more and more chaotic. The war between black communities began occurring. Everyone killed anyone they met. The president contacted Mandela and talked about the situation, which was becoming more chaotic, and asked if this was the peace. Mandela went to the street and saw bodies lying on the grounds. He then received a letter that he read in a press conference where the content emphasized that there was never peace and they were fed up with the government. With that, they asked Mandela to give them weapons instead of peace. Mandela began talking about his struggle where he was willing to die to get this peace. He also said that he had lost 27 years of his life in prison, but he decided to forgive, hoping everyone could follow his way. He also reminded his people that they would lose the war, but they still had a chance to win the election. Therefore, he told all his people to stay at home peacefully and vote when the next election began. On April 27, 1994, elections were held according to Mandela's wishes. All citizens had the same voting rights, and one by one they put in their ballots. The ANC won the election and Mandela was elected as the first black president of South Africa. Everyone had a party to celebrate their victory.